He described it 3 times to his spiritual directors, and then he stopped. Not because the memory faded. He insisted until the last year of his life that he could still see it if he closed his eyes too long. But because he reached a conclusion that almost no one quotes when they talk about his visions. He testified that every attempt to describe hell in human words made it smaller than it was, and a smaller hell was a more dangerous lie than no description at all. That sentence is the reason the loudest visionary of the 20th century became, on this one subject, almost completely silent in public. There is one exception. A single letter dated April 18, 1918, sent from the friary at San Giovanni Rotondo to his spiritual director, Padre Benedetto Nardo of San Marco in Lamis, 5 handwritten pages, the ink slightly smeared on the 3rd sheet because his stigmatic wounds had reopened while he was writing, in which he put down what he refused to put down anywhere else. He wrote it once. He never repeated it. And before this is finished, you are going to know what was in that letter. You are going to know the exact words Christ spoke to him about the souls living now, souls breathing in the same century you are breathing in, and you are going to know the one specific thing he did every single morning from that day until his death in September of 1968 because of what he had seen. If those 3 things matter to you, stay where you are, because most of what circulates about his visions is the soft version, and the soft version is exactly what he warned against. And if you want the harder version as it keeps coming, the bell under this is how you keep finding it. Here is the part that unsettles the people who study him seriously. He was not afraid of describing hell because the imagery was too violent. He was afraid because the imagery was not violent enough. Sit with that for 1 second. There is someone reading this who has been told, gently, for years, that hell is mostly a metaphor, that a good God could not allow what the old paintings showed. And you have built a quiet peace on top of that idea without ever testing it. The man with the bleeding hands, who spent 16 hours a day in a confessional that smelled of beeswax and damp wool, looked directly at the thing your peace depends on not existing. And what he wrote to Padre Benedetto in 1918 was not a softer version. It was harder. And the part that made him stop describing it afterward was not the fire. It was something he named first before the fire on the 2nd page of that letter. And once you see what it was, you understand why he never wrote it down again. The word he chose first, before any image of flame or pit, was abandonment. Not abandonment by God in the way a sentimental homily uses the term. He was precise, but a specific interior state he described as the soul finally seeing itself without the borrowed light it had been living inside its entire earthly life. He wrote that the damned do not arrive in hell and discover a punishment imposed on them from outside. They arrive and discover what they actually are when nothing of God's mercy is held against the wound anymore to keep it from bleeding out. That is the sentence professors at the Pontifical Gregorian have quoted in closed seminars for decades and almost never read aloud at a pulpit, because the moment you read it aloud, you have to explain it, and the explanation removes every soft escape route a comfortable Catholic has been quietly relying on. The fire, he wrote on the 3rd page, was real. He did not retreat from the image, but the fire was the consequence, not the architecture. The architecture was the soul standing in front of the truth of itself with no remaining capacity to look away.
He described the souls he was permitted to see as not screaming the way paintings show.
He described them as silent in a way that was worse than screaming, because the screaming would have meant they still believed something could change. They had stopped believing it. That was what he named first. There is someone reading this whose hands are slightly cold right now, who has been quietly convinced for years that the worst thing that could happen after death is non-existence, that nothingness would be a relief. And what Pio described is the precise refutation of that fantasy. The damned, he wrote, want non-existence more than anything, and the one thing they cannot have is non-existence. They are conscious of themselves at a depth they spent their whole earthly life avoiding, and there is no longer any noise loud enough, any distraction thick enough, any companion close enough to drown that consciousness out. He underlined a phrase on the 4th page. Padre Benedetto preserved the letter, and the underline is visible in the archive at San Giovanni Rotondo, and the phrase was that the souls he saw were not strangers. They looked, he wrote, like people he had passed in the street, like people who had attended Mass, like people who, by every external measure, had lived ordinary Catholic lives. That is the line the seminaries copy out and the pulpits leave alone. Because once you accept that the population of what he saw was made up of ordinary Catholic lives, the next question becomes unavoidable. What specifically had those ordinary lives been missing? And the answer to that question is not in the 1918 letter. The answer is in something Christ spoke to him directly about the century you are living in right now. The sentence Christ spoke to him, recorded in the depositions gathered for the canonization process and preserved in the Positio Super Virtutibus, filed with the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, was this: and his spiritual daughter, Cleonice Morcaldi, testified to having heard him repeat it 3 separate times across the years she knew him. The souls of this age are losing themselves, not because they reject me, but because they no longer believe there is anything serious enough in them to be lost. Read that twice. The vulnerability of the modern soul, according to what Pio reported Christ saying, is not unbelief in the loud sense. It is not the atheist on the corner. It is something subtler and almost universal, a quiet inner conviction that nothing a person does on an ordinary Tuesday could possibly carry the weight of eternity. That conviction, Christ told him, is the specific blindness of this century. The earlier centuries sinned and trembled. This one sins and shrugs. And the shrug, Pio understood from that moment forward, was more dangerous than the sin, because the shrug was what kept the sin from ever being brought to the only place it could be undone. He repeated to Padre Augustino, his confessor, that Christ had shown him souls who would have been saved in any previous century, souls whose actual sins were lighter than those of canonized penitents, and who were lost because they could not, in their final hours, take their own lives seriously enough to ask for what was freely offered. That is the line that does not get preached, because to preach it, the priest has to first admit it about himself. There is someone reading this whose last real confession was longer ago than they want to count. And the reason is not pride and not laziness. It is exactly this: a quiet, almost reasonable suspicion that what you would have to confess is too small to matter, that God is busy with worse, that your life is not heavy enough to deserve that kind of attention. The blindness Christ described to Pio is sitting on you right now, and it is wearing the costume of humility. He warned his spiritual children to watch for it under that exact disguise. The pulpits stay quiet on this because the moment a priest names it from the altar, every comfortable Catholic in the pews has to choose between admitting it or hardening against it. And a hardened pew is harder to soften the second time. But Pio named it anyway, one soul at a time, behind a curtain in a confessional booth. And there was one specific sin he heard more than any other. One sin he became convinced was filling hell in his own lifetime. And most of the people confessing it did not believe it was a sin at all. The sin was presumption. Not the dramatic kind theologians put in textbooks, not, "I will sin because God forgives." The quiet, domesticated, almost devout kind. The version that wears Sunday clothes and walks to communion every week without ever having truly asked itself what it is bringing to the altar. Pio named it from the confessional more than any other transgression, and his fellow Capuchins at San Giovanni Rotondo testified in the canonization process that he repeated in private conversation with the friars that more souls were entering hell through presumption in his lifetime than through any spectacular sin of the flesh. He defined it precisely. Presumption was not hoping in mercy. Presumption was assuming mercy without ever turning toward it, receiving it as an automatic byproduct of being a basically decent person, of having been baptized, of showing up. The penitent who knelt down and recited a generic list and stood up unchanged, that was the soul he watched walk out and grieved over. Because nothing had been brought, nothing had been named, nothing had been surrendered. The wood of the kneeler was warm from the previous body, the smell of old incense hung in the curtain, and the words had been spoken, but the wound had not been opened. And an unopened wound, he wrote to one of his spiritual daughters, cannot be touched even by the physician himself. He was sharp with these penitents. There are recorded instances, preserved in the testimonies collected from those who knew him, of Pio refusing absolution and sending the person away, not in cruelty, but in mercy, because he understood that giving a false absolution to a presumptuous soul was sealing a wound that needed to be left open until it was honestly shown. He told one woman, recorded in the deposition of Maria Pile, that it was better to leave the confessional without absolution and weep all night than to leave with the words and never weep at all. Sit with that. If you have been carrying the assumption quietly for years that you are fine, that your faults are unremarkable, that confession is a formality you do not really need, that God's mercy will round up at the end because of course it will, what Pio is naming is exactly the architecture of your sense of safety. He is not saying you are wicked. He is saying the wickedness is not the danger. The danger is the unexamined certainty that nothing significant is at stake in you. And that certainty, Christ had shown him, is the door through which most ordinary Catholic lives walk into what cannot be reversed. He did not name this sin to terrify the people who came to him. He named it because he had seen what came of leaving it unnamed. And because he had seen it, he began doing something specific himself, every single morning before the sun rose. Something he never abandoned. Something he told his brothers was the only honest response a man could make once he had been shown what he had been shown. He rose at 3:30 in the morning, before the bells, before the other friars, before the first gray light reached the stone floor of his cell. And the first thing he did, the practice he never broke from the year of the vision until the last week of his life, was to offer that day's Mass hours before he would actually celebrate it,
for one specific soul he believed would die before the next sunrise. Not the souls in general, not the dying as a category. One. A soul he did not know by name, a soul whose face he had never seen, a soul somewhere in the world whose final hour was that day. He told his brothers, Padre Eusebio of Castelpetroso recorded this in his memoirs of the friary, that after what he had been shown, he could not bear the thought of a single person standing in front of the truth of themselves without someone, somewhere, having already pleaded for them by name in the dark. That was the mechanism, not abstract intercession. A specific soul on a specific day, named to God before the world woke up. He held the count carefully. He told one of his closest spiritual sons that in any given 24 hours, somewhere on the earth, around 150,000 people die, and that if even one of them was lifted out of presumption into honest sorrow because someone had stood between them and their own blindness at 3 a.m, the practice was already worth more than every other thing he did that day. The fire that came afterward, the long Mass, the 16 hours in the confessional, the wounds, all of it flowed from this single morning act. He insisted on the order. First, the offering, then everything else.
There is someone reading this who has been told for years to offer it up, without anyone ever explaining what offering actually does. And you have quietly stopped believing it does anything at all. What Pio did every morning was not a sentimental gesture. It was a transaction he believed reorganized the eternal trajectory of a person he would never meet. He told the friars something they preserved almost word for word, that the cold of his cell at that hour, the stiffness and the stigmatic wounds, the resistance of his own body to rising, all of it was the price, and the price was the proof that the offering was real. A free offering, he insisted, would have been a counterfeit, because what he had seen was not free, and what was being lifted out of it could not be lifted by something cheap. He never told his spiritual children to imitate the schedule. He told them to imitate the structure. One soul, one specific soul, one specific day, named in the dark before the world begins its noise. That, he insisted, was what the vision was for. Not to be remembered, but to be answered every morning by someone willing to stand in the gap before the gap closed. And there were specific times when the gap did not stay theoretical. When Pio recognized, in his own confessional or at his own altar, a soul standing inside the exact danger he had been shown. The first case is on record from January of 1922. A man named Giovanni Savino, a stonemason from San Giovanni Rotondo, came to Pio's confessional for what he treated as a routine annual confession. Pio stopped him before he could begin. He told him plainly that within 4 days an accident would take part of his face, and that he needed to make this confession as though it were his last, because if he made it the way he had made the previous ones, it would be. Savino later testified, in writing, that he had been on the verge of dismissing the warning when the smell of the booth, that specific dampness of old wool and candle smoke, seemed to thicken around him. He confessed differently than he had ever confessed. 3 days later, a charge of dynamite detonated prematurely on his work site and destroyed his right eye. He lived. He attributed his survival not to luck, but to the confession he made because Pio recognized something in him he could not yet see in himself. The second case is recorded in the depositions of Padre Carmelo of Cesano, vice postulator for the cause.
A woman approached the confessional in 1944, lifted the curtain, knelt, and before she opened her mouth, Pio told her to go home and bring back the rosary she had thrown into the river when her son died at the front. She had told no one, not her sister, not her parish priest, not the friars she greeted every Sunday. She had thrown it in at night, 3 years earlier, alone. She left the booth without confessing, walked to the river, waded into the shallows, and according to the testimony recovered from the riverbed, a rosary she could not have located by any natural means. Pio absolved her the following morning. There is someone reading this who has been carrying one specific act of quiet rejection, something you have buried so carefully that you have almost convinced yourself it did not happen. And what these cases demonstrate is that the danger is not that God has forgotten it. The danger is that you have. And the forgetting is the thing keeping the wound from closing. The third case, recorded in 1959 in the depositions of Padre Alessio Parente, who served as Pio's assistant in the final years, a young man in his 20s knelt down, gave his name, and Pio refused to hear him until he admitted out loud the specific sin he had come intending to omit. The man refused. Pio closed the grate. The man returned the next morning and named it. He later entered religious life and testified that what Pio had seen in him at the grate was not the sin, it was the architecture of the omission, the specific shape of the soul that had been preparing over years to die without ever naming the one thing that needed naming. 3 people, 3 moments, 3 souls who would have walked into exactly what the 1918 letter described and were turned by a man at a curtain away from the door. And there is one more documented exchange, different from these 3, more unsettling, when Pio sat across from someone who told him plainly that hell did not frighten them at all. The exchange is preserved in the recollections of Padre Agostino of San Marco in Lamis, Pio's longtime confessor, who recorded it in his diary entry for the autumn of 1939. A visitor, an educated man, well-dressed, polite, sat down and told Pio, calmly, that he had no fear of hell because God is infinite mercy, and infinite mercy cannot, by definition, condemn anyone forever. He spoke the way a person speaks who has worked out the argument and is satisfied with it. Pio listened without interrupting. The room was quiet enough that the man could hear the clock in the corridor. And then Pio answered him with one sentence that theologians have cited ever since as one of the most precise things ever spoken about the relationship between mercy and justice. Mercy is not the absence of justice. It is justice that has been allowed to do its work in time. And what you call mercy after death is only the name you give to the door you refused to walk through while it was open. Read that again. The man, Padre Agostino noted, did not answer. He sat for what the diary records as several minutes without speaking. Pio added something quieter afterward, that to claim God's mercy will save a soul that never turned toward it is to ask mercy to do violence to the very freedom mercy was given to protect. That is the line theology students copy out.
Because it dissolves, in a single stroke, the entire architecture of soft universalism without ever denying that God is merciful. Mercy is not a force that overrides the soul. Mercy is the open door. The soul that spent its life refusing to look at the door does not, at the moment of death, suddenly see it differently. It sees it exactly as it has been seeing it, and walks past it exactly as it has been walking past it, into the consequence of that refusal becoming permanent. If you have ever quietly told yourself that you do not really need to fear what Pio described because God is too good for it to be real, what he answered that man in 1939 is answered to you. He was not arguing that God is harsh. He was arguing the opposite. He was arguing that God is so respectful of the freedom he gave you that he will not, even at the end, force open a hand that has spent a lifetime closing. The mercy is real. The mercy is infinite. The mercy is also a door, and a door is something a soul walks through, not something a soul is dragged through against the direction of its own life. The visitor, according to the same diary, returned 3 weeks later. He knelt at the grate. He made a confession that lasted, by Padre Agostino's account, the better part of 2 hours. He did not have the argument anymore. He had something better, the only thing the argument had been protecting him from. And what Pio understood from the morning of the 1918 letter until the last Mass he ever offered was that everything written in that letter, every word Christ spoke about modern souls, every soul recognized at the grate, every offering made before sunrise, was never meant to stay in his life. It was meant to reach the one person who would carry it home and do something with it before the next sunset. I told you at the start that you would know what was inside the 1918 letter to Padre Benedetto Nardo. And you do. Abandonment, named before the fire. Ordinary Catholic faces inside what the paintings made strange. The souls who had stopped believing anything could change. I told you that you would know the words Christ spoke about the souls of this age, and you do. That they are losing themselves not by rejection, but by the quiet certainty that nothing in them is heavy enough to be lost. The blindness wearing the costume of humility. And I told you that you would know the one thing Pio did every morning from that vision until the last week of his life. And you do. One specific soul, named in the dark at 3:30, before anything else of the day was permitted to begin. Picture him on the morning of April 19th, 1918, the day after he sent the letter. The friary cold, the candle low, the wounds in his hands stiff from the night, walking from his cell to the altar without speaking to anyone, because what he had written down had taken something out of him that ordinary words could not put back. He offered the Mass for one soul that morning. He never told anyone whose. He died 50 years later, in September of 1968, having repeated that same offering somewhere near 18,000 times. There is someone listening to this who has been living a normal week, work, errands, evenings that pass without wait, and what you have heard tonight is not meant to ruin that week. It is meant to put one thing inside it that was not there before. There is someone who is afraid it is already too late, that what you have buried has been buried too long for anyone to lift, and what Giovanni Savino and the woman at the river and the young man at the grate prove is that the thing keeping the wound open is not God's distance. It is your distance from naming it. There is someone who has wanted to believe, for years, that mercy covers everything without effort. And what Pio told the visitor in 1939 was the kindest possible correction. That mercy is the door, not the dragging. There is someone who has not made a real confession in account of years they would rather not say aloud.
And tonight you have heard exactly why that count matters. There is someone who has never offered a single morning for a soul they would never meet. And tonight you have been shown the mechanism. Here is the one specific thing for tomorrow. Before you check your phone, before the noise begins, before the day takes you, name one soul. Not a category. One. Someone dying somewhere on the earth in the next 24 hours whose face you will never see. Offer the day for them by name in the dark, even if the only name you have for them is the one God knows. Pio did this for 50 years because he had seen what was at stake. You do not need the vision to do what the vision was for. Let us pray. Lord, we thank you that you did not leave us without warning, that you sent a man with bleeding hands to tell us in 1918 and in 1939 and in every confession he ever heard what is actually at stake in an ordinary life. We admit we have been small about our own souls. We have called it humility, and it was sleep. We have called it mercy, and it was avoidance. For the woman who threw the rosary into the river, for the visitor who came back 3 weeks later and knelt for 2 hours, for every soul named in the dark before sunrise, teach us to take ourselves seriously enough to take your mercy seriously. Wake the part of us that has stopped believing anything in us is heavy enough to be lost. And if there is someone we love who has stopped believing it about themselves, let our morning, tomorrow, be the gap we stand in for them. Amen.
Tell me one thing in the comments. Which moment in this hit you hardest? The letter, the door, or the morning? And if you have ever wondered what Padre Pio actually said about the exact hour of death, the words he repeated to dying souls at the bedside that even his fellow Capuchins were forbidden to write down for 30 years, that is what waits in the next one.